Everybody, welcome to Professional Editors Podcast, episode 106. This is Dave Arney. Unfortunately, I am not joined today by Karen Conlon, my partner in crime. However, we have a very special guest host. I'd like to introduce you guys to author Lichen Craig. Lichen, how's it going today?
Oh, wow. I get to be a guest host. Now, I
Yes,
like that. I
yes,
like
you
that.
are. Um, would you like to give us just a quick, sort of brief rundown of your experience both in writing and editing?
Sure. I've been writing for more than 30 years, mostly nonfiction, up until about a year ago, and when I published my first novel. And this is, 30 years of writing for pay professionally. I had an excellent education in order to do that. And I also do editing on the side. I edit mostly novels, some screenplays, collections of short stories, just anything like that, fiction. And I really enjoy editing. So when you asked me to do this, David, I just jumped at it. I thought it would be a really interesting subject to talk about and also to get some good information out there to especially new writers and people that are just starting to navigate their way through the publishing industry and thinking about hiring an editor.
And actually, that's today's topic. We had originally asked Lycan on because she is going through the the editorial
Yeah.
process herself on one of her short stories with another editor, and as well as herself being an editor. And actually, I'm doing the same thing. My upcoming summer series. For one of my imprints is with my editor right now, and we had a very interesting discussion this morning that I might get to a little bit later in the show. So we wanted to take the time today to talk about how to work with an editor. And so we thought we'd start off with some funny stories, just because I want everyone to know that, even the best editors have a bad day sometimes. And, there are just times where you run into little conflicts with editors. I mean, we're not, as much as we may try to be, we're not God or gods or goddesses, and so we have to, use our best judgment whenever we can. So, you were telling me about the semicolon comma issue that you run into recently. Can you give us just a
Oh
sort of a
gosh.
little rundown on that? Because I found it very funny.
Yeah. Well, it, I write in a very specific style, and what I do, and David and I were talking about this, that I hear the book in my head as if it's being read out loud. And so I punctuate according to what I'm hearing. And I'm very sensitive to how a sentence can be read and how reading it in various tones or with various pauses in different places can change the meaning of a sentence. So I punctuate accordingly. And punctuation is very specific with me. Now, I understand that an editor might have suggestions as to what might work differently or work better, and I'm open minded to that, believe me. But I was working with an editor that really didn't understand the meaning of the phrase comma splice. She was actually misusing that phrase. Um, what a comma splice is it's a comma placed between two independent clauses. That is um, two phrases that could each stand alone as a sentence. And often you'll see a semicolon to separate two independent clauses. A comma splice is when you have a comma instead of a semicolon. But what she was doing is taking my commas and, writing this is a comma splice, and when they were not surrounded by independent clauses. And I just wanted to say, no, sweetheart, that is not a comma splice, and that's there for a reason.
And we
And
actually we did a whole show talking about punctuation and the comma, and all the various uses. And I mean, you point out exactly what we were saying, and that is that punctuation arose to declare the spaces between clauses and phrases so that it flows correctly when spoken.
yeah,
And
right.
so it you can't just stick one in versus another for some sort of aesthetic reason, or
Yes.
misunderstanding of the comma splice rule. And sometimes, and I think that you can go with this too, sometimes run on comma splicing style is just part of what's being written as well. So
Yes.
hunting them down simply because they exist without looking at their context is not necessarily a good editorial decision either.
Exactly. And sometimes it is style. I always tell people as an editor, what I'm looking for in their writing is anything that makes it difficult for the reader to understand the sentence or to understand the sentence in the way it was intended by the writer.
Amen.
So if a reader has to go back and read a sentence, and we've all been in a situation where we read a sentence in a book and went, "Huh?"
Exactly.
And
Yeah.
we had to go back and read it 3 or 4 times before we figured out what it meant. You should never have to run into a sentence like that. And so I would consider one thing that's part of an editor's job is to eliminate those problems and to make the text flow as smoothly as possible so that the reader doesn't have to stop and think, now, what did that mean? The reader should be reading forward with no stops and no uncomfortable pauses.
That's exactly. I was
And
posting an article today in my personal stream on G Plus. It had to do with how errors aren't necessarily evidence of carelessness. But the point that I was trying to make is that errors are not a good thing to have. I certainly don't say that we should just ignore errors. But what errors really do is not break a rule, but break the flow of meaning, break the flow of the
yes,
effect.
there you
That's
go.
that's why you want to get rid of them. That's why you want to work with an editor. That's why you want to have another pair of eyes on everything that you write, because you want to make sure that your meaning is as clear as it possibly can be. And there's no way. I'm just going to state this emphatically. There's no way that you by yourself can ever figure all of it out. You need
I
one
I
more person
absolutely
at
agree.
least.
I absolutely agree, and most writers would agree with this. It's amazing. I mean, even at the level of training that you and I have had, David, it's amazing how you can write something and give it to someone else, and they'll find errors all over the place. And I think what happens is that the human brain will look at something that it itself has created and kind of fill in gaps so that you can read a sentence and you read it as you intended it and as you want it to appear,
I can tell you that is
not the way it
100%.
really is.
That is 100% exactly what happens. My degree
Right.
actually is in psychology and in cognition. I can tell you for certain that is exactly what your brain does. Especially bad for me because I write first person present tense. So when I'm writing, I am the character. And it was funny because I got a note back from my editor today, and she was saying I have a lot of approximation in this opening chapter, and I had to sit back and I had to divorce myself from the character's mindset and try to come to it with my editor brain on, because
Uh-huh.
it was so naturally what the character was saying to me in my head. And but I was able to step back and I was able to identify, oh, okay, here's the intentional pieces, and then here are some times where maybe I just got a little bit lazy in the writing process. But no, it's fascinating. It's exactly fascinating that your brain, the human brain, every human's brain, it strives to fill in all the blanks. In fact, if you've ever studied Gestalt theory, either you, Lichen, or anyone out there, you'll know that we pick out the smallest amount of details possible in order to make up an entire image, because
Yeah.
the amount of stimuli, either visual or auditory, at any moment in time. Even right now, when you're listening to this podcast, you are literally attuning to my voice and hopefully and tuning out a whole bunch of other pieces of stimuli that are going on all around you. So no, the brain has to sort of fill in the blanks and move forward. So as editors, I mean, I like that. That's a great metaphor. I'm gonna post that somewhere. But the idea is that we're there to keep that flow going, to keep you from getting distracted and getting out of the mix, not necessarily to force writers to comply to some mythical set of rules, or at least that's how I look
Exactly.
at it. Well,
Exactly.
we wanted to get in today on how to work with, select, and some of the myths about working with an editor. So I thought we'd just sort of jump right in and talk about the selection process. I know that you and I have slightly different viewpoints on this, but we just wanted to kind of throw out some words that are used often in conjunction with editors, and then talk about a little bit about what they usually mean. And
Good idea.
the big difference is the big distinctions that you will hear most of the time is copy and line editing, and those can actually be separate things, but those are usually sort of on one side of the editor spectrum, and then developmental editing can be and is at times broken off from copy or line editing. So copy and line editing and this comes from the history of editing, where you would have actual departments that would specifically just look at grammar and punctuation, and they wouldn't necessarily look at story or character or those kind of things. And the book would go through two or three types of editing in the process. So that's kind of where these rules come from. But when you hear the word copy or line editing, it's usually referring more toward grammar, punctuation, usage. Copy editors in particular will help you identify misuse of word or double use of word to mean the same thing. And
Right.
that can be broken out, not always, but it can be broken out from developmental editing. So when you hear someone say, "Oh, I did developmental editing," and you'll hear me say that I do developmental editing, what I'm talking about in that sort of concept is I'm going to work with plot, story, marketability, readability, genre marketing, maybe some more of the business things. Managing editors at a publishing house are often also the developmental editors for whatever line that they're working on. But you have sort of another take on this, and I want everyone to hear your opinion on this subject. So please go ahead.
Well, I really agree with everything you're saying now that we're clarifying it. Um, I had pointed out to David earlier that I think that there are, both in publishing houses and independently, a lot of editors out there that offer both services, so that you have someone who's doing some light, proofreading, or what you would call line editing, copy editing, but also at the same time they're looking at your plot, whether it works the way you've structured it, whether it is designed to have the most impact on the reader the way it's structured. And then they're looking for things like inconsistencies in logic. I have a funny example of that.
Oh, please share.
I reviewed a book a year ago or so where the writer had a main character gathering things into a gunny sack and going to one location that was several miles from where he began and assembled the gunny sack. So he's taken this sack with him and then jumps on a horse. Excuse me. Jumps on a horse, and when he doesn't have time to take the gunny sack on the horse. He jumps on the horse and runs off on this horse, gets back to the original location, and suddenly he has the gunny sack again.
That's
And
yeah.
there was just no way that logically was going to happen.
I
There's
like to look at it.
another
Oh, I'm sorry.
there's
Go ahead.
another instance. This one's hysterical. There's another instance where a writer had written a mystery that was actually fairly well written, and I felt really bad about this ending. But the mystery was fairly well written, but the entire argument is that there was a person who had hung themselves in the hayloft of a barn, and what they had to do is go up in the hayloft, put the noose around their neck, and jump, so that they were hung in the barn. And during the course of solving the murder mystery, the police detectives were having a big discussion about how it would have taken someone strong and big to drag this person up the stairs and have killed them, and then staged this hanging. So put a noose around their neck and staged the hanging. But in the end, the killer turns out to be a woman
Mm.
that is like 5'4" and 120 pounds, and
Yeah.
we're supposed to believe that she dragged the body up the hayloft and through. Just problems in logic like that are something that a second pair of eyes will catch, and believe me, readers will catch it, and
Yeah.
reviewers will catch it.
Well, there's a lot of times where, like, when I'm reading through a story, and I never fault the author for it, but I'll be able to pick out when they came up with the idea in the writing process.
Yeah.
Especially for people that aren't very strong outliners, or don't do a sort of a big outline when they start. I'll sort of be able to tell, oh, you came up with this idea right here, didn't you? And they'll say, yeah, and it's not a problem because you can developmentally edit that and go back and sort of structure it in and foreshadow it earlier, or just make sure that it occurs a little bit earlier in the writing process. But
Right.
There's times where your creative process hides from you the fact that you're being inconsistent. You're not even meaning to. It's not even a conscious thing. So yeah, just having, especially when we talk about developmental, having that aspect of, oh, okay, this is a really great idea, but you know what, we need to stretch it backward. We need to properly set it up so that it, like you said, has the right impact.
And you need to understand how to use things like foreshadowing and when
Hmm.
it's too much and when it's
Exactly. Yeah.
enough. And
I don't
someone
enjoy
that's
being
an
slapped in the face by the
experienced,
red herrings.
yeah. And someone that's an experienced editor will be able to help you do that if you're not doing it properly, and will help you be able to do some things like, I keep using the example foreshadowing, but some more advanced literary techniques that make your book a well-written book as opposed to just another story out there on the market. So we
Well,
were
as
talking about how to choose an editor, and that's the
right.
kind of thing you're looking for.
Yeah, and I thought
Is
we should kind of
someone,
get into a little bit. So here's my general recommendations for when you're thinking about what type of editor do you need. I noticed that a lot of people who, like you, I would say, who are very strong already in plot and development, oftentimes they may come to me, but I will probably tell them, you know what, it's probably better if you go for someone who's a copy editor. You're going to get a little bit of a cleaner copy, out of your book. So,
hmm
whereas people who are quote unquote pantsers or who maybe don't edit as strongly, you may want to look for someone like Lichen or like myself who does both some of the copy and line editing as well as able to sort of look at the advanced features of the plot and the structure, so that you are getting the chance to really get some of those creative juices that you had in the middle of the story. Make sure that they stretch and really round out. And I call it closing the circle. But you have this really great sort of structure, this really great arc, but you need to loop that back around and really close it up and make it nice and tight. So if
right.
that's the case, then you may be looking at wanting to find someone who specifically works with developmental issues. Now, as freelance editors, most of us do both. Most of us do, in fact, more than both. So you do want to sort of look at who you're working with and what they offer. Like Karen, for instance, does not do developmental editing; she does copy editing.
hmm
So if you were looking for someone to really work with you on tightening up your story, Karen wouldn't necessarily be the person to choose. If you're looking to completely be totally free of errors, and that's something that I admit for myself, I usually don't take on a plain old line editing job. That's not
Yeah,
one. That's not one
and
of my absolute strengths. So I will tell someone, if you need just pure line editing and you need some very specific line editing skills, then that's probably who you want to go find, and it's not necessarily me.
yeah, and that, in old-fashioned terms, that's someone you would term a proofreader,
Hmm.
and I, I work the same way. I will say to someone, if I'm finding, that I'm having to correct my way through every sentence, this person is never going to be able to pay me worth my time because it's an enormously time consuming job to do a lot of meticulous line editing.
And it
And
takes you
and
out of the
frankly,
story too, which makes it harder to do the
it does.
developmental side of the job.
It
And that's
does.
that's for me
Exactly.
particularly.
And I will just say to someone, yeah, I'm going to give this back to you, and you need to have a proofreader look at it or go through it again yourself. Because if you're at the point where you're turning in a novel to be edited, you should be at the point where you can spell simple words. you know. So,
Oh, I do have to stand up for my dyslexic friends. Is that there are partnerships and resources out there too, so that just because you
yeah,
can't spell,
yeah,
don't let that distract you from being a writer. I'm dyslexic. Spelling does not come easy to me. Trust me. It's been a very long, hard fought battle, but there are things to do. There are resources, and I had a couple really great teachers that literally saved my life when it really comes down to it. By showing me how to be better at something that I love, which is writing. So yeah, but you're right that this is something to
and
consider when you're working with
it's
your
not
editor.
just spelling. I mean, I use spelling as an
Oh yeah, yeah.
example, but
Oh
I'm
yeah.
talking about, basic grammar, basic punctuation. You should hand in a manuscript that does have those things intact.
There are some
And
skills as a writer that you
if,
want
yeah,
to work on and develop before you hire an editor.
exactly.
Definitely.
Exactly. So by the time you get to an editor that's going to be looking at developmental issues, you want to have your manuscript fairly clean already. And I'm warning writers because many editors will take a look at the first few chapters and say, "I'm sorry, I'm not going to work on this. It's a mess."
Thanks for listening. This has been part one of our special with Lichen Craig and choosing an editor. Tune in next week for part two. You can always find us online at Google Plus, the professional editors page. Both Karen and I are available on Google Plus as well.